The year is 1769 and France has just conquered the independent Republic of Corsica. Months later, a boy is born in the Corsican town of Ajaccio, the second of 8, to parents Carlo and Letizia, and he is named Napoleon. Almost 10 years later, at the age of 9, he moves to Autun, where he enrolls in school, but just a few months later transfers with a scholarship to a military academy in Brienne-le-Château. There he gains his first victory, leading the junior students to victory over the seniors in a mass snowball fight. He completes his studies in 1784, and is admitted to the École Militaire Military Academy in Paris, where he is forced to complete a 2-year course in one after his father passes away. He graduates in 1785 as a second lieutenant in an artillery regiment and serves in Auxonne and Valence for the next 4 years, until after the French Revolution reaches its climax, with the Revolutionary Republic replacing the monarchy, although fighting will continue between the two sides for years to come. Napoleon returns to Corsica on leave, where a complex three-way struggle between pro-French Corsican Republicans, nationalists, and royalists is taking place. Although initially a devoted nationalist, he is eventually swayed by the ideals of the revolution and joins the Republicans. He is promoted to captain, then lieutenant colonel while in Corsica, but is forced to flee to Toulon after coming into conflict with Paoli, the leader of the Corsican nationalists. He is appointed senior gunner and artillery commander in the Battle of Toulon in 1793 between the French Republic and the French Royalists, backed by the First Coalition. He devises a plan to capture a hill overlooking the town and use artillery to force the British garrison to evacuate, helping win the siege and earning him a promotion to colonel. Later that year he is promoted again to brigadier general. And in the following years, Napoleon goes on to help win 2 other battles before moving back to Paris, where in 1795 royalists try and take the city. Napoleon is put in charge of a defense against 7,000 royalists and effectively uses cannons with grapeshot to win the battle. He is then put in charge of the French army of Italy and leads his forces to victory during the battles of the Montenotte campaign. It starts with the Battle of Montenotte itself. And ends with the Battle of Mondovi, with Sardinia signing an armistice removing them from the First Coalition. Napoleon continues to fight against the Austrian forces. He besieges Mantua in 1796 and fends off several relief attempts. In the Battle of Lonato, Napoleon is almost captured, but he tricks the Austrians into thinking his whole army is nearby, and they quickly surrender. At the Second Battle of Bassano, he suffers his first tactical loss, followed by another loss and tactical retreat at the Battle of Caldiero. But Napoleon wins the next several battles, and with no relief, Mantua falls. This leads the Austrians to sue for peace. The war against the First Coalition ends in 1797 at the Battle of Tarvis. In 1798, Napoleon conquers Malta, ending the Hospitaller rule, then invades the Ottoman Empire in Egypt and Syria in an attempt to create a staging ground from which the French Republic could threaten British India, and maybe force the British into a peace. Napoleon wins battle after battle against the Ottoman Empire, including the Battle of the Pyramids, where Napoleon defeats a much larger Ottoman army, with the Ottoman army suffering 10,000 casualties, including 3,000 elite Mamluk cavalry. He wins several more battles until, at the Siege of Acre in 1799, the Ottoman Empire, with the help of British artillery and naval support, defeat Napoleon. Napoleon retreats to Egypt, Then, hearing about a crisis in France, with the war between the French and the Second Coalition kicking off, returns to France where he orchestrates a coup to become the first consul of the Republic, the de facto leader. He leads the Italy offensive against the Austrians, and takes a force over the Alps to attack the Austrian supply lines. Napoleon swiftly removes the Austrians from Italy, and the war ends with several peace agreements in 1802. Napoleon is crowned Emperor of the French Empire in 1804, after a rigged referendum sees 99% of the 3.5 million voters in agreement on his ascendance. He is also crowned King of Italy in 1805. Later in the year, the War of the Third Coalition starts, and Napoleon leads forces against the Austrians once again, starting with the Battle of Ulm, a series of skirmishes that lasted several days. The battle was created to confuse the Austrians and was won with no major conflict. He fights and wins another battle against the Austrians and Russians in the decisive Battle of Austerlitz, often cited as a tactical masterpiece. The War of the Fourth Coalition starts in 1806. Napoleon fights against the Prussians in the Battle of Jena-Auerstadt and breaks the Prussian army, inflicting many casualties on the enemy. He then foments an uprising in Greater Poland to tie down the Prussian forces there. In 1807, Napoleon wins a series of battles against the Russians and Prussians. After some Pyrrhic victories during the first several battles, Napoleon scores a decisive victory against the Russian and Prussian forces at the Battle of Friedland. The engagement effectively ends the War of the Fourth Coalition, and is considered the height of French power in Europe, as there are now no powers that can challenge the French domination on the mainland. In 1808, Napoleon turns on his Spanish ally and deposes of the King of Spain, replacing him with his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, but the Spanish revolt against the French occupation and a war ensues, which will last until 1814. Napoleon fights just 2 battles against the Spanish before leaving the Peninsular War to his generals. In hopes to take advantage of the Peninsular War, Austria and other European powers that were not under French control launched the War of the Fifth Coalition against France and its allies. Napoleon leads armies against the Austrians once again, defeating them in multiple battles. In the Battle of Echmühl, the French seize the initiative. A month later, Napoleon suffers defeat at the Battle of Aspern-Essling, although casualties are high on both sides. The Battle of Wagram in early July brings an end to the war. It is the largest battle in European history to this point, with over 170,000 soldiers on each side and tens of thousands of casualties. A few years later, in 1812, Napoleon launches an invasion of Russia in an attempt to force them back into a continental blockade of the United Kingdom. At the Battle of Borodino, Napoleon defeats the Russian army, but failing to completely destroy them, they retreat deeper into hostile Russian territory. The French occupy and abandon Moscow and wait for a Russian surrender, but the surrender never comes. And after 5 weeks of waiting, Napoleon attempts to retreat what is left of his forces, but they are harassed by Cossacks, partisans, and the Russian army. The invasion ends in complete disaster. It is one of the most lethal military operations in history and severely weakens the French army ahead of the War of the Sixth Coalition, which breaks out just a few months later. On the heels of the failed invasion of Russia, a large coalition forms to once again try and bring down Napoleon and his empire. The coalition draws Austria, Prussia, Russia, Spain, the United Kingdom, Portugal, Sweden, Sardinia, and several small German states into conflict with France. Even after the disastrous Russian invasion, Napoleon manages to assemble a large army of over 200,000 troops, but most are woefully inexperienced. Napoleon wins several battles against the coalition at the beginning of the war, but at a very high cost. The victories are followed by a couple defeats, including the Battle of Leipzig, otherwise known as the Battle of the Nations, which is the largest battle in Europe prior to World War I, with Napoleon bringing over 200,000 soldiers and the coalition force being almost 400,000. Napoleon is forced to retreat to France, and his puppet state, the Confederation of the Rhine, is dissolved. Napoleon wins most of the following battles he commands, but it is not enough to defeat the overwhelming coalition forces. Paris falls, and learning of this, his generals refuse to fight, and Napoleon is forced to abdicate. He is exiled to Elba, a small island in the Mediterranean, which he is granted sovereignty over. Before his exile takes place, he attempts suicide with a pill he carries on him in case of capture, but its age has lessened its potency, and he survives. Once on the island, he sets about radically transforming it, and in just a few months he has a small navy and army and improves the productivity of the island. Upon hearing rumours that he was going to be banished to a remote island in the Atlantic Ocean, Napoleon takes a ship and 700 men and lands in France in 1815. He starts heading north, and the 5th Regiment is sent to intercept him. They make contact just south of Grenoble. Napoleon dismounts his horse, walks toward the regiment until he is within gunshot range. There he stops and shouts to the soldiers, "Here I am! Kill your emperor if you wish." At that, the regiment shouts, "Vive l'Empereur!" And he continues north with an ever-growing army. Days later, the powers of Great Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria each pledge 150,000 troops to put an end to Napoleon once and for all. Napoleon meets the Prussians on the battlefield at Ligny, where he gains the last victory of his career. He defeats the Prussians, but the bulk of the Prussian force remains intact. 2 days later, he meets the Allied forces at the Battle of Waterloo, where he is, for the final time, defeated. He returns to Paris, and finding that both the legislature and the people had turned against him, he abdicates in favour of his son. He surrenders to a British ship on the 15th of July 1815 and is taken to the island of St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, and kept under British custody until he dies on May 5th, 1821, from stomach cancer. His remains are to this day entombed in a sarcophagus in the crypt under Les Invalides. The world after Napoleon experienced an era of relative peace and cooperation, led by the power of Great Britain, and referred to as the Pax Britannica. The Napoleonic Wars were some of the fiercest conflicts in European history. An estimated 6 million people lost their lives to the wars, over 3% of the population of Europe at the time. That would be the equivalent of 24 million today. That is more than half the population of Spain, or almost half the population of Italy. And the geopolitical results of the war can still be seen in places to this day.